when there's some issues. But I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera back off to deal with our bandwidth. So welcome to today's intro to fruit tree pruning. My name is Graham McCarty. I'm a local foods and small farms educator, and I'm up in Northern Illinois, and I serve Daviess-Stephenson and Winnebago counties. I know there's a number of individuals on today's call from other parts of the state, and so to give you a little bit of understanding of where I am geographically located. I've been teaching fruit tree pruning classes since 2017, and in most years we actually have this in the classroom, and yet I know this year we've had to modify it. So I certainly appreciate a lot of you all being a part of this journey, if you will, in changing how we deliver our fruit tree pruning classes. What you're going to see today is a mixture of fruit tree pruning, fruit tree photos that are from my family farm back in Tennessee, some trees that really need some attention and something that we've really tried to work on the last couple of years, as well as some new trees that I've planted this last year that are dwarf and semi-dwarf. And that's kind of where we come from with today's class, trying to help those that have trees that haven't been pruned for years on a tree that maybe is 25 or 30 years old and is a standard tree, as well as also try to focus on those dwarf, semi-dwarf trees that are maybe 5 or 6 years old that are reaching their maturity of 14 to 16 feet tall. And maybe you pruned them last year or a couple years ago, but now you need a refresher. We'll also get into pruning some of those trees that maybe you just planted this past spring and you're curious what needs to be pruned, as well as maybe they have just been planted in the last 2 years, or you're thinking about planting in this upcoming 2021 growing season. So that's what I've tried to do today. A lot of the fruit trees we're going to focus on will be apple and pear, as that tends to be where a lot of growers tend to grow. But I've also included stone fruit such as cherry, peach, and plum, as we do sometimes see those fruit trees in our growing area. A number of you all sent in photos of your fruit trees, and I've tried to incorporate them in today's presentation. So you will see some of those photos as we go along today, and certainly I will send those back to you with some additional potential guidance to share with you. So here's today's plan. We'll talk a lot about kind of getting started. You know, as this is a very introduction course, I want to make sure that we put you all kind of on the ground level of, you know, if you've never pruned before, or if you want to revisit pruning, kind of what to really consider when it comes to fruit trees. We'll get into some of the general cuts you need to make. What are some things that need to be pruned out? What are some things to kind of stay and give a little bit more time of growth for? What I've tried to really do is provide a lot of examples with photos that I have myself from some of my family fruit trees, those that individuals have provided too, to help you begin to think more critically on your fruit trees and how you need to get them pruned properly. We'll get into the next cuts, because this could be that you have pruned pretty well the last couple of years, and yet maybe you're at a stage where you need to think a bit more long-term. Perhaps you pruned really well last season, and now you're seeing some growth and need to think a bit more about what that tree could look like in the next 3 to 4 years. And also mention some resources in here as well. What I've tried to do is modify this a little bit, so it will be a lot more focused on pruning. I will talk some about disease management off and on, but certainly I'm kind of focusing really on pruning with this. The photo you see here on the left is Virginia Beauty. It's an apple tree that my family has in Tennessee. My grandparents planted a family orchard when they retired, and so these trees have been planted since the 1980s, and we have about 60 to 65 of these trees that are down there, some that are dwarf, semi-dwarf, standard, but many of which have not been pruned well for the last couple of years. So as you will see today, I am showing you some trees that need to be pruned from my own experience, as you may have trees that look very similar to this as well. So one of the things that we have to consider when it comes to just thinking about pruning fruit trees is really knowing the tree. When we think about our trees in our backyard, or the ones we may want to plant this upcoming season, the dwarf and the semi-dwarf trees really can maybe be pruned slightly different than a tree that has grown for 10 or 15 years that has a lot of growth and a lot that could be removed. When we talk about a dwarf tree, we're typically talking about a tree that will reach 8 to 10 feet once it reaches maturity. For a semi-dwarf tree, we're thinking about a 14 to 16 foot tall tree that will reach maturity. When we focus in on pruning basics though, we've got a couple of different styles. We have the central leader style, which is for apples and pears. Those tend to be the best ones that work really well for central leader, but sometimes you could also do peaches and cherries with that as well. We have the espalier, which is apples and pears that do really well on that design. And I'll get into some of that because we did have some folks ask about that design, which is what you see here on the left in this photo. When we look at stone fruit, this is peaches, cherries, and other stone fruit groups that do well on a compass, an open fruit bowl, and a vase shape. All of those words are very interchangeable when it comes to that group. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today, is these different styles and then utilizing photos that can kind of help you figure out if your trees could eventually get to what works really well for them, or if they're maybe in a style that's just going to have to kind of tolerate, if you will. The central leader style is also one that is very similar to a Christmas tree shape. So if you think about that Christmas tree shape, where the lower branches will always be much longer than the upper branches, that is sometimes what you're really thinking about when it comes to the apple and pear. Some of the pruning basics that I get asked when I teach this class are here. One of the questions is, when can I prune? And really what we see in Northern Illinois is mid-December to March 1st. And I've placed an asterisk here on March 1st because there are some years where you certainly could go beyond that March 1st date. And you may have a couple of weeks where you could be pruning still your fruit trees. But I still receive every year phone calls from people in mid-May asking if they can prune their fruit trees. And you're too late at that point. The reason for this is that in a lot of cases, you may have a fruit tree that will have a very big cut, and it needs time to seal that cut up before it actually moves into its next growth stage. And if you prune too late, you may find that window to seal those cuts and those wounds up is too close, and the tree will not be ready to move to that next growth stage. So aim for about March 1st is kind of that cutoff date. So now to March 1st is what we really see. At the same time, as you think about a tree that has a lot of cuts that need to be done, or a tree that needs a lot more attention, recognize that we're really only talking about 30 to 40% per season. So as you look at your tree, you're only going to be making cuts that will equal about 30 to 40% of that entire tree. What that means is that if you have a tree that has numerous big limbs that are going to be removed or need to be removed, you're going to have to stagger those out for a couple of years. And that's what we'll talk about today, is kind of staggering some of those big cuts because they're such a massive part of that tree. And this 30 to 40% is true for dwarf, semi-dwarf, and standard trees. And as you can think about that, certainly a semi-dwarf or dwarf tree may not have much that needs to be pruned out if we're still reflective on the 30 to 40%. One of the things that you will also encounter if you are going out to get pruning equipment is always in the same aisle, you will see this pruning seal spray. And we do not recommend it for fruit tree pruning. This spray is something that if you cut part of your tree, a limb, you will then kind of apply it. And yet we do not recommend it because it tends to seal in moisture. And it is actually liable to kill that tree because it's locking in moisture. If you prune at the right time of the year, you will find that whatever wounds there were from the cuts you made will seal up properly without using this product. So ignore this product, do not purchase it, do not use it with it. One of the other things that you will see in the literature when it comes to fruit tree pruning is this dormant oil. And the dormant oil is typically something that's applied to address aphids, spider mites, scales, some of those very small insects. And while it has that name dormant oil, it actually needs to be applied when the temperatures in the daytime are in the 30s and 40s Fahrenheit. And so that is something that would be applied probably in March or probably in April after your pruning. So don't apply that dormant oil at the same time on your tree as you're pruning. You need to wait till the temperatures get there. Occasionally, we also encounter folks that, they don't have enough time to prune everything. And one of the things that we still recommend is like, try to get some of those water sprouts suckers out. Some of those very small pencil width growths can easily be removed pretty quickly. And the reason to remove them is that if you think about where they're at on your tree, they can sometimes double and triple in width very quickly in the next couple of years. And so while right now they're very tiny, very small and a nuisance, you can imagine that the width of them is going to get bigger and bigger, and it could become a bigger problem for you for years to come if you don't kind of do that. What about topping a tree? If you have a tree that just has a lot of growth and you don't really know, where to get going, for a fruit tree especially, we don't recommend topping the tree. The reason is because when you come through and kind of do a clear cut of that tree, which you see here in this photo, the growth is going to focus up there. So while you already had a problem with all that growth, and now you come through and you cut it again, the problem is still going to persist. And that is one of the unfortunate things when it comes to, say, a standard fruit tree that is 25, 30 feet tall, is that we certainly know the fruit is very high up in the tree, and we know a lot of the growth is higher up in the tree, and yet we're trying to get that growth closer to ground level. And so that's a bit of the problem with this topping method, is that you already had a problem with the growth higher up in the tree, and as soon as you do kind of that clear cut, you're still going to have that problem. It's also possible that it could kill that tree in the future. And the reason we say that it could kill it is because you're creating so many cuts that the tree may not be able to properly seal up all of those wounds that have been created through that cut as it moves into its next growth stage. We also deal quite a lot with fire blight on apples and pears. And that is one disease that is really known to really go into some of these wounds on the tree, which could then potentially kill that tree. That's one of the main destructive diseases on fruit trees. So it could just be very hard to heal up. As I've taught this class, certainly we've had folks that this has happened where they have topped the tree. And the thing that if it has been topped, that you want to think about is you need to, if you can, come in there and leave just one limb from that direction, from each kind of cut, and remove the rest. So it's almost as if if you see kind of this middle tree here where you have 3 growths, you want to leave behind one of them to kind of take over that branch. That's really what you're really after there. And that could hopefully address the problem in the short term. In addition, for fruit trees especially, we don't want to do any summer pruning. I know that it can be very, you look at all the growth that's happening on your tree in the summer from your winter pruning, and yet we really don't want to do any pruning at that time. The reason is because they're just not in dormancy yet. They're still in a very different growth stage, and we really need them to kind of move into dormancy before we do any sort of pruning. So certainly not any big limbs should be pruned in the summer. If you do have an urge, because I get that people have an urge to do some pruning when they see all of these suckers and water sprouts, you might be able to do a little bit of it, if they are pencil width in their width. But anything bigger than that, I really just don't encourage it. We also don't encourage any pruning in late summer and the fall. And the reason for this is that the trees are not going to have enough time to seal up those cuts before entering into dormancy in the late winter or early winter rather. So certainly don't do any of pruning late summer and the fall. For our area, what we're saying here is try not to do it. We really don't want you to do it mid-August into the fall period. So I know that some of you all sent photos of dwarf trees and semi-dwarf trees, and I myself also have some dwarf trees too. And it's going to be a very similar approach as any regular sized tree. As we think about what the shape of the tree should be, as we think about, how we should prune it to get it into where it needs to go, you're going to find a very similar approach with these. I think the benefit you do have is that many of them, a problem that might have persisted can be addressed pretty easily because this tree is only reaching a certain height compared to a standard tree or a much older tree. We see a lot of times if you have newly planted trees in the last couple of years, the wood on them is very bendy. You can kind of move it around and get it into the shape that it needs to be, which is really what you see here in this drawing of a whipped tree. But at the same time, you want to be really cautious of cutting too much from that tree in a given year. We're still taking back to 30 to 40% on a dwarf or a semi-dwarf tree. And that may not be a lot, especially those first couple of years. In this drawing you see here, they're talking about a whipped tree. And a whipped tree is one that you have ordered, say, from Stark Brothers or Jung's, and it arrives without any limbs whatsoever. It just looks like a twig. It feels like you've ordered a twig instead of an actual fruit tree. And with a whipped tree in the spring, we do see that by June and July, it starts to get growth, and then you could do a little bit of pruning to kind of help it get in shape. But it is one where you can just weigh those limbs, which you see here, to get with the shape that you're really after. As I've taught this class over the last couple of years, I encounter questions about fruit tree problems. And certainly in our growing area in Northern Illinois, we do have issues when it comes to our fruit trees. We still at the University of Illinois Extension recommend fruit trees, but certainly we have to recognize that we're not always going to have that perfect season, or perhaps we're going to have an issue every couple of years. So one of the things that we encounter a lot of is that you're growing fruit trees and there's no yields whatsoever. You haven't gotten any fruit. One of the things that we have run into is that some folks have only planted one variety in their backyard. So it could be that they have 3 apple trees in their backyard, but only all 3 of those trees are Honeycrisp trees. So the truth is that you need more than one variety of apple that is flowering at the same time in order to get apples from those trees. You can also, of course, use a crab apple that's flowering at the same time too. In the last 2 years, we've seen a very late spring frost in end of April and mid-May really affect the fruit buds on our apples. So while the apples have certainly survived those very cold winters, they're getting hit hard with a late spring frost. And this is resulting in bud damage on them. For peaches, plums, and even cherry trees, they're strongly affected by a very cold winter. We're just not going to see any fruit on them. And -8 degrees Fahrenheit is their cutoff date. And if we reach those air temperatures for a couple of days, usually consecutive days, that can result in the loss of those fruit buds, or it may severely damage them in the springtime. The issue with the peaches, plums, and cherries is that they are going to produce fruit buds the previous summer, which then have to overwinter in the wintertime before then producing the actual peaches and cherries in the spring. So what that means is that, I planted peach trees this past spring. They have fruit buds in summer 2020. My peach buds have to survive my winter 2021 before then finally producing those peaches in the summertime. So that's the main issue that we encounter with those. So we still recommend planting them, but just recognize that winter can be an issue with them as well. You may find you're in biennial fruiting where you have yields really great one year and then you have none the next year. That is something where you just haven't pruned enough, but we could also encounter cold spring. Excessive fruit drop. This is very common on a lot of standard fruit trees where they just have so many limbs and so many spurs that are where the actual apples and pears are developing, and they will just drop a lot of fruit. So a very common thing to happen, usually around July, is where we see a fruit drop, and really pruning should help alleviate some of them. So what I really want you to understand is that there are some things that certainly is in your control, such as, pruning could hopefully address fruit drop and biennial fruiting, but there are still some things that are not in your control when it comes to our winter temperatures, our late spring frosts that we encounter. So our pruning goals then, one of the things that we really are after, and I want you to hopefully works well for you, is to get the scaffold branches closer to harvest level. And you're gonna see this term often today talking about these scaffold branches. And the scaffold branches are really what is producing the fruit on your apples, pears, and so many of those other fruit trees that you're growing. And typically, these scaffold branches are at eye level. You're able to harvest from them. But certainly sometimes the scaffold branches are much higher up in the trees and it's very hard to get fruit from them. We also want to consider pruning out wood that really interferes with the tree's productivity. So some of these limbs that we'll talk about today are just not serving you any purpose. They're weighing the tree down, it's growing into the tree, so it's not doing you much good, or it's going in a direction that's just not going to really help you out. What I also want to get across is that these are your fruit trees. You're going to hear me talk about some of the individuals that send in fruit trees today of, this is what I think you could prune out or what you should leave. And at the end of the day, they're your fruit trees. And you know full well what shape is maybe going to work the best for your backyard or your growing area. We also want to consider keeping disease from spreading. So we'll talk a little bit about that just because this is a time where disease can sometimes be spreading too. And one of the things I hope you get out of today is that, you're not just pruning in the winter of 2021. You're going to keep pruning every single year with this. So pruning with a long-term focus is really what you're going to be encountering and what you have to deal with fruit trees. The way that I tend to approach trees is from two directions. I tend to think that especially a tree that has not been pruned for years, or one of those very tall standard trees, or even a semi-dwarf or dwarf tree that has some age to it, they have two categories. You have what I call high productivity, where in 3 years, we're going to get this tree in really good tip-top shape. And what that's going to be is that every year for the next 3 seasons, I'm going to try to remove about 30 to 40% of the tree limbs each year to get them into better shape. And this is going to be things like a big limb will come out. This could be suckers, water sprouts, smaller limbs, all of those others that are kind of interfering with that tree shape. And we're not going to do any kind of topping in this sense with it. And so this high productivity could work pretty well for a lot of you all, especially if you think about semi-dwarf or dwarf trees, and even maybe some of those standard trees that could work well. And when we think about these cuts, all of these cuts combined, if you think of them like a mathematical equation, we'll get to that 30 to 40% each year is what we're really after. You also then have the toleration. It is like, I'm going to go out to my orchard. I'm going to remove some of the water sprouts, some of those suckers that are just kind of hanging out, kind of getting out in the way. I might take out some of those larger limbs with the chainsaw that are dead, that they interfere with my equipment. But I'm not going to do so much pruning on them. I'm just going to kind of be like, it's a 25-year-old tree. We're going to try to have it have some shape. We're going to hope that it's going to fruit for us, but I'm not going to do as much as robust pruning like a high productivity might be. You can have both of those in your orchard. That is certainly how my family operates. We have a dwarf, semi-dwarfs that are going through a high productivity pruning in the last 2 years. We have trees that are toleration that, we're pruning some out of things that we're just kind of a bit cautious about, but we're not doing as much as we really could. So the tools of the trade, what might you consider adding, putting on the Christmas list, purchasing to put you on the right path for fruit tree pruning? This is the most of the equipment that I use. So you see kind of in the upper left-hand corner, my loppers. These work really well for a lot of the pruning that I do on our fruit trees at the Rockford Extension Office, as well as some of the trees that I have in my home garden growing area. You also note there's a bit of an extender with them, which I really like for some of my trees where I need to get a little bit high up in them. I also have a bit of a smaller handsaw that has some teeth with it that can really cut in some of those limbs that I use. And then of course, some very small hand pruners for those smaller limbs that I deal with on dwarf and semi-dwarf. I also have a bigger saw for some of those other limbs that might need to kind of get cut through a little differently that my other tools are not going to use, that I'll have. You might encounter that you need a chainsaw, especially for very big limbs. They may need a chainsaw to kind of get through them. You also note that I have a bottle of rubbing alcohol. And the reason for this is that as we think about cuts from that tree, we want to try to prevent disease from spreading, especially on apples and pears. And so really try to, as much as you can, make sure that you're dipping these tools into rubbing alcohol, as you're moving among your trees, because we really want to lessen any spread of especially fire blight on apples and pears. And this is just a good practice that can really help you. I recognize that this is a little laborious, especially as we think about, well, Grant, how are you going to use rubbing alcohol on a chainsaw? But certainly just be a little bit cautious of spreading disease, especially for trees that you may have encountered that had fire blight. Some additional thoughts here on pest management. And yet again, I'm not going to go too much into it today. I really want to focus on pruning. But certainly during pruning, one of the things that you can really do to keep pests from moving in, such as diseases, is to cut correctly. And you can kind of see here this idea of a branched collar right where my blue arrow is, where you're just kind of cutting right before it starts to kind of create that collar bump on this photo of an apple tree that you see here. Kind of making a very clean cut is really what you're after here, so that that wound that has been made through the cut can seal up properly. You also, of course, want to, yet again, think about rubbing alcohol, consider wiping down equipment as you're kind of moving through your orchard or among your trees. One of the other things to mention right now is that if you have anything like apples and pears where their leaves have fallen underneath the tree, you want to try to rake those up if you can. The reason for this is that the leaf debris of apples and pears under the tree tends to have apple scab, a pretty bad disease in some years that if the litter from the fall underneath the tree, those leaves, is allowed to stay there into the spring where it gets wet, when the rain hits those leaves, it can tend to move the apple scab spores straight up into the tree. So basically you're reinfecting the tree from the previous year. So try to rake those away and try to maybe bag up and destroy them if you can, just because that leaf debris can be where apple scab moves in. You may have a tree though that has some resistance for apple scab, just FYI. Pruning, after pruning, to mention again, dormant spray certainly could be applied. You're not required to apply it, but certainly it could be something that could be utilized when we're getting to the 30s and 40s in March and April. So for your bigger cuts, maybe you have a very big limb that's almost big as width as your forearm, or maybe even bigger. We certainly know that if you just came in and just did one single cut, you may find that there's so much weight off of that limb that it could actually tear and cut into your main central leader branch, which is not what we want. So you see here in this diagram, if you're thinking of limbs that may require many cuts just to remove one limb. And that's what you see is like, ideally your first cut will be underneath that limb. Your second cut will be just slightly above it, a little bit above that one. And then your final cut will be very close to the main central leader trunk of your tree. And the reason for this is just to alleviate some of that weight that could be possibly break off and damage your tree. You see that a little bit here in this photo as well, where they've come in and done a couple of different cuts before actually doing kind of the main cut on that tree. One of the other questions that I get a lot is, where, say I have a very smaller limb, where actually am I going to actually do that cut? And one of the things you want to look for is the actual spurs on your apple and your pear tree. And this is what you see here in this photo here. These are the actual spurs that will produce your fruit in the springtime. So that's what you're looking for. That's where the actual apples and the pears are going to develop. The smaller photo you see here with a very small stem, that's going to be your leaf bud. So it's not going to develop your fruit. It's just going to be a leaf bud. As you look through some of your limbs on your apples and your pears, you'll start to notice the spurs and the leaf buds. And as you can imagine, a lot of those very small pencil width type suckers and water sprouts, those are going to have mostly leaf buds on them. You may see occasionally a spur, but predominantly the spurs are going to be on your scaffold branches. And so that's really what you're kind of looking for, is the spurs where your apples are going to develop, as well as the leaf buds here. In the drawings that you see here, I kind of threw together yesterday. The top one, you can actually see that when it comes to how far to prune back the limb, a lot of it's going to be where the actual spur is. And so you're just going about ½ an inch away from it, and you want to do a slant with that as well. The reason for that slant is that it is more likely to heal up properly, kind of the wound will heal up much properly than if you were going to do one that is straight up and down. That's really what you're after, is more of that slant direction with it. And yet again, you know, you're thinking back, okay, how long do I want my big lateral branches, and then how far in can I go? One of the other things you see in this bottom photo is that when we actually think about, okay, this is a branch I want to keep, but I still think it needs to be pruned. And so what you're thinking about here is, you know, I've got branches, they're going 3 different directions at the end, and yet neither of these directions is what I really want to go. I don't want the branches to be growing vertically, and I don't want the branch to be growing downward. So I'm coming back just to where, or right before, that branch starts to grow in different directions. And that's sometimes what you also encounter, is that, you know, as you follow your branch all the way out, you may find that it's going in the right direction, but you need to prune out 2 different directions, and you want to keep one direction forward with it. So that's kind of a strategy you want to think about with it. And we'll get more into this as we go along today with this too. So the central leader tree structure, this, we're talking about pears, we're talking about apples. It can also work for peaches and others too, but predominantly we're thinking critically more about kind of the Christmas tree shape here, and apples and pears. So you see here we have a central leader branch in the green, and you're going to see this a lot on some of the fruit tree photos that we talk about today. The leader branch works really well. It provides enough support and a structure for your trees. The scaffold branches are going to be in blue, and that's what you note here. And the scaffolds are in which you're going to have the fruit develop off of. Those very small spurs is where you're going to actually see the fruit develop off of them. You see suckers are in yellow, and those are going to be further at the base of the tree. A lot of times the suckers are going to be very easy to remove. They're right at the base of the tree. They're not serving any purpose for you. Water sprouts are in the red and the purple. And if you think about the water sprouts, these are really very young scaffold branches. If they were left on the tree, they could certainly develop into a scaffold. And maybe that's what you need. You need to kind of baby them for a couple of years if they're going in the right direction. So they will eventually become scaffolds. It's just that at this stage, they're not ready yet. But sometimes these are ones that can easily be coming out. You can see that a water sprout is growing right into the tree. It's growing downward from the tree. It's not serving any purpose on the scaffold branch. And it's really just putting more weight on those scaffold branches too. We could also have secondary scaffolds in red. Yet again, these might be a very thicker water sprout that has been there for a couple of years at this point. Another thing to consider is that as we think more about having good scaffold branches up against the tree, you may find that some of them are too close to the tree. And really what we're after is scaffold branches that are at 45 to 60 degree angle, because that will provide enough support for the scaffolds to not break out. But certainly I've encountered trees where the scaffold branch is almost growing all the way up against that main central leader branch. And the concern there is that if it is not at the right degrees, it's liable to get bigger and bigger, and it could actually break off of the central leader and damage that tree. That's the main kind of concern there. So once you think about this, once you have kind of looked at your tree and seen where this leader is located, you're then going to kind of do kind of the basics every year. So every year, you're going to look for dead wood and try to prune that out. You're going to look a lot for water sprouts, and frankly, you're going to find a lot of water sprouts. That's some of the main growth every year is water sprouts, and you will find that that will really collectively add up quickly to 30 to 40% with them. You may find that there are branches that are vertical, they're downward, they're growing inward into the tree. You could have branches that are crossing over one another that are just not serving you any purpose here. And then at the same time, if you are at a stage where you've pruned really well the last couple of years, you might consider thinking about replacements. You might consider thinking, okay, I want to think about replacing this scaffold branch because I just don't like it. Or maybe you're thinking more about, how could I make my central leader in a much better shape? And maybe that means that you kind of find a replacement perhaps for it. But one of the things to consider is also finding your big cut. A lot of times when folks send me photos of their fruit trees to kind of help figure out how to prune, I may find 4 or 5 different big cuts, 4 or 5 limbs that need to come out. And yet we cannot take them all out in one season. We need to kind of let them sit there, take out one the first year, and then have in mind what the next couple of ones will look like. So you can see kind of in this drawing from our extension resource, a little bit similar to what we kind of just went into. And we'll get more into photos as we go along today. But you can kind of see that, all right, I'm looking for dead branches. I'm looking for broken branches to prune out. A lot of the water shoots are coming out. The crossing branches, anything like that can certainly come out with it too. Suckers from the base of the trunk and from the roots, all those are coming out easily. And this can start to add up pretty quickly. Some of these kind of little basic things that you need to be doing, along with, maybe you're coming through and removing one of those other big branches to get there in its shape. So a couple of photos to kind of show you what we get here. Dead wood, this is one of my trees in Tennessee. Lots of it's very dead. You can kind of tell based on its feel. When I've touched this particular branch before, the wood just starts breaking off. And really, I'm trying to remove as much of that as I can. And you're going to encounter it this season too, that you probably have some dead wood that could come out. In most cases, I would say that any dead wood should not be added to your 30 to 40% of cuts each year, because at this point, the dead wood is dead. It's not, living material whatsoever. But you may find some dead wood would be easily ones that could come out that season. Some of our trees also have just everything. We've got branches that are crossing, those that are growing vertically, growing downward, they're growing inward into the tree. So it's just a big hairball of a mess of limbs that it can be a little bit intimidating where to start. And I think what we've encountered is that, if we're dealing with a hairball, if you will, that's certainly not scientific, is to think first about removing the water sprouts, taking out some of the smaller limbs first, to give us a greater understanding of then, okay, what am I really dealing with? And are these branches where if I followed back to the tree, that one big cut could remove that whole piece? Yet again, this photo here on the right is one from a standard tree. So certainly there's a lot that can be pruned out, but the tree can also withstand that 30 to 40%. The suckers is on a tree that you see here. This is it is a cider tree. It looks really rough, and yet it's one that has produced off and on in our orchard. And you can certainly see that, all these very small suckers at the base of the tree just need to be pruned out. And then from there, trying to clean up the tree into some state or form with it. One of the things I see a lot of with pruning and see a lot of with homeowners and others is you may have competing leaders. So you see I have 2 leaders in place on this tree in this right photo, and yet both of these leaders are such a big part of the tree that I need to tolerate the tree. I just need to accept that based on how big these leaders are, I can't take out one without it really sending a shock through that tree. And that may be what you have with your trees as well. You may find that there is some trees that you certainly could have gotten in them just on one leader 10, 15 years ago. And yet, because of the growth of both of them where they're competing, you really are at a state where you have to tolerate them. So as I look at this tree and what we've had to do, we're tolerating that this tree will always have 2 leaders, and that the pruning that we will be doing will be water sprouts, will be hoping to develop scaffolds a little bit better, but certainly not planning to remove one of those leaders because it's just such a big part of the tree at this point. Sometimes you can certainly remove a competing leader pretty easily, especially for those younger trees. But you may find for standard trees and others that you have, that's kind of what you have to deal with, is tolerated. Some other issues that you may encounter. You may come out and realize you've got a lot of bird damage. We've encountered woodpeckers before that have just put a lot of holes and other things into the tree. Typically, a very loose burlap wrap around the area can really help with that, can really kind of help it, provide some protection. You may even encounter that we've had a strong summer weather pattern and it has damaged some of your fruit trees, and you may need to support that tree. Certainly that's something that we've encountered in our orchard, is that we had this tree here. This is an apple tree. It certainly doesn't look like an apple tree, and yet it's one that has been supported for the last 10 years and often does okay with fruit, but certainly is just in a place where it's at, where we have to prune and expect that it's just going to have this support for the rest of its life, or maybe your tree is for a couple of years with it. If you did have some limb loss during the season, so for instance, if you came out and there was summer damage and that hurt your tree, you may find that you needed to prune during that time, do a little bit of pruning. We still would not recommend any kind of sealant, and then hope for recovery at that point. So really, we're not always at a place where we want to say, go ahead and remove that tree. But certainly if I had limb loss in July and I had to do a little bit of pruning at that point, I may have found that I have already done enough pruning for my season. I may find I'm not going to do any more because of that. Deer, wildlife damage. This is actually something that may lessen and mean that you don't need to prune for the season, especially on dwarf, semi-dwarf trees. The photo you see here is one of my peach trees, my dwarf peach tree that I planted this past spring. And I received deer damage the first week of October. And you'll see photos of this tree later on today, but I had to come in and remediate it. I had to come in and actually prune that broken limb, which you see here. And because of the size of this tree, I'm not fully expecting to do much pruning this season on this tree. Certainly because it's young, but also because the deer have already pruned this tree for me, unfortunately. You may also look to do deer guard kind of around the base of the tree. And there's a photo I'll show you of a deer guard later today that one of our participants sent in. Also try to keep the area around the tree at the base, remove the mulch around the base of the tree. A lot of times wildlife and other things will kind of go into this area of wood chips, mulch that you might have in place, and they can cause further damage on that tree. You could also hang Irish Spring soap or other soap deterrent around the neck of the tree. You could also do hot pepper spray. This could be something applied to the limbs of the tree. That tends to be a deterrent for the deer. The only issue is that when you have a lot of rain and weather, it tends to wash away. There is also some hot pepper sprays out there that are not labeled for use on fruit and vegetables. So focus on those that are used for fruit and vegetables. What if you have a deep cut in the leader? Let's say you have an issue where you sustained a cut the previous season and now you still have that issue this upcoming year. You may find that that tree needs some time to recover, or you may find that it's just never going to recover. So it can be a little bit hard to determine what the best course of action is. I would still say, you know, if I had a tree and a big limb fell off of it, a big scaffold fell off of it and caused a big cut in that leader, I may find that I don't want to do as much pruning this season so that that leader can focus on healing itself as it's gone into dormancy and gone into the next year. So one of the methods that I came up with a couple years ago as I started to think about this class was to do some coloring. I use Microsoft Paint. I've shifted over to a couple of other programs, and I will upload these photos into that program, and it allows me to color my trees. And so what that means is that, you know, I've got these photos, I have an idea of where my leader is, I had an idea of where my leader branches, my lateral, my scaffold branches are, and then I can also see where the water sprouts, the suckers, the vertical branches are to help me figure out what my tree could look like or what are some main challenges that I'm dealing with in that tree and help me get a path toward understanding what needs to stay and what needs to be pruned out. And certainly this is something that you could do. You could take it on Microsoft Paint. I've been shifting over and doing some more with my iPad, which you'll see today, some of these photos. But this could help you figure out what could stay and what needs to go and figure out where your issues are, where maybe your issues aren't. And this is something that I could do for you as well. If you know, some participants have sent me photos and I've done this for theirs and they'll get them back at the end today. And still have to recognize, of course, that this is just 2D. Certainly we're not seeing the full picture of the tree, but it can at least help us to understand of what that tree shape should start to look like. And if it could ever get there, because certainly you could have a tree that's just never going to get there, and that's okay. So the previous photo is one of my trees. You can see this is one of my family farm trees. You know, we've got a couple of dueling central leaders happening here. And certainly because of the age of this tree, we're really not at a place where we could really do a lot of, you know, shifting around or moving the lateral, rather the central leader branches away. But I could certainly define the direction of that central leader with it. So you can kind of see that on the right side, that central leader starts to branch off in two directions. And one of the methods that I could do is to kind of remove one of those directions and try to get more of a straight direction with that central leader. You also note in the red, I have a number of water sprouts that are really not serving me much purpose. They're just growing vertically on that tree. However, maybe there's one or two that could be a replacement scaffold on for a scaffold that I might want to remove too with it as well with it. But certainly for this tree, I'm probably going to keep it as just two central leaders at this point. The tree you saw earlier, so you know, we saw there's a lot of suckers and water sprouts that could easily come out, and that's what you see in the red here. Many of these can be removed quite easily, and that then leaves me, you know, a bit of a defined central leader in the green here. I've got scaffold branches in the blue. The only word of caution with this tree I see is that on my right side, that far, very low blue lateral branch is just a little bit too low. And it would be better for me to kind of move that up a place to have it be more in line with my other scaffolds. As you can also imagine with this tree, it's very much a toleration tree. It is one that we're just keeping it going because it's something my grandparents planted. We're hoping for some yields here and there, but certainly we're not fully expecting that this tree is going to be, you know, high productivity for us. It is more that let's see if we could get in some kind of order, but it may just be a little bit more toleration pruning that needs to occur. Once we've kind of gone through, okay, I'm going to try to remove dead wood, I'm going to go for water sprouts, suckers, maybe some of the secondary scaffolds that are in the way. I then want to think more about maybe those upper limbs. Perhaps there are some limbs higher up in the tree that could be removed that could really change how that tree looks overall and what its tree shape looks like. You may also find that you have one where you have competing leaders in place. One or two of those competing leaders could come out, and then you can move it back to that main shape you're after, maybe that main Christmas tree shape. Another thing that I'm always kind of cautious of and want to state is that this is a great time to think about replacement scaffolds. So if you have a tree that is 25, 30 feet tall in the air, or one that even it's a little bit too high for you, could you find some scaffolds or some water sprouts that are developing against the tree that could be groomed and become replacement scaffolds? This is a great time to really consider that, those kind of smaller branches lower on the tree. Typically what we find is that, maybe about 3 feet is where your first scaffold line should really be in place, and then kind of go from there with next spacing. This is also a good time to think about your narrow crotch angles. So certainly it could be a limb that is too close to the tree and you want to think about, okay, I'm probably just going to go ahead and remove it. But also what you're going to find is assessing cuts in the summer and next winter is really what you're after here. The photo you see here, it has certainly 2 competing leaders, and because of this tree shape, there's just no way to take out one of these limbs and move back to the other. So this is certainly one that we are going to keep in its right shape and just let it do its thing and develop and grow. If I was to, remove one of those limbs, one of those competing leaders, it would just cause too much damage on that tree and probably not be able to really get the yields I would expect. So you can kind of see here with this coloring where we've got these 2 competing leaders, you've got your scaffold branches on either side, and it's certainly a toleration tree at this point. I may find that there are some replacement scaffolds right below that first line of blue scaffolds. I could find maybe there's a water sprout right below it that could be a replacement. But at this stage, it's almost like you're trying to even out both of these limbs, both of these central leaders. So into growing season and next, certainly look for the replacements. Your tree is going to respond, and it's going to respond hopefully with what you want. You're going to get a lot of growth from where you are doing any kind of pruning. Looking after fruit fall is also a great time. So in the summertime, look to see where limbs are developing, where limbs are hopefully becoming good replacements for you. And then what I think you're going to find, especially if you're doing that 30 to 40% of pruning each year, is there's going to be an effect of that weight loss. You're going to find that the tree is going to respond differently. And you may find that the branch that you were really after removing is now a branch that you want to keep. Or perhaps you removed a branch that certainly needed to come out, and now a water sprout has developed that can take over for that branch that you didn't want to keep in the first place. So I always try to take photos every year of my trees and still continue to color them, because it starts to help me see that what I plan to do pruned and take out in the winter of 2021 may look entirely different each year for the next couple of years. I could find that my game plan has changed. So to give you an example of this is that Virginia Beauty that you saw earlier in today's presentation. And there were 3 branches that you see here on the left that we were wanting to remove because they were just very big. And they curved at a certain point, which we weren't really comfortable with. And we were very concerned that the bigger these branches got, they were liable to split the tree. And this is certainly a toleration tree, but it's a very much loved tree in our family with very good fruit. And it was last year, the pruning that we did was to take out this big limb. So that was our big cut for the year. And the response of the tree then was to create all of these water sprouts that you see here. And certainly most of them are not ones that we really want. But there might be a couple in here that maybe we leave behind because they're a little bit lower on that tree, and they could potentially replace some of those other branches that we're wanting to get rid of. Certainly there's a lot on the right of those water sprouts that we don't want, but there's probably 1 or 2 in here that we might see what happens over the next couple of years. This branch that was pruned out is one of 3 big cuts that we have planned to make on the tree. So certainly we're trying to kind of remove these bigger branches that are right behind it, and potentially we could replace with them. But you can see how massive this trunk is on a 30-year-old apple tree that we really like a lot of. So it's always to be expected that, whatever pruning you do is going to result in water sprout development. That's one thing that there is no secret. Whatever pruning you do, you're going to expect to have water sprouts on here, unfortunately. This tree was pruned 2 seasons ago, and so you can kind of see that, it is a dwarf tree, or rather a semi-dwarf tree. You can kind of see that the response of pruning was a lot of water sprout development in the red, and that's what you note in the black circle there, is that there's a number of limbs within there that could be pruned out, but there's probably one or two in there that we could try to get into shape as a scaffold branch to replace maybe one of those branches much higher up in that tree. So you can almost see that, it could be happening. At the same time, I was sharing you that, we think about 30 to 40% of an actual tree is what we're after to prune every year. And you can see that when we think about 30 to 40% on a semi-dwarf tree, it can be just some small branches that need to come out to get there. Certainly, you can see I have what I classify as 2 central leader limbs, and yet the one on the right does need to be slowly pruned out. But I'm worried that if I took out that entire branch in a single season, that I'm talking about almost 50% of that total tree. So it would be such a massive cut that I'm really cautious of actually pruning out that entire tree with it. You can certainly see that it does need to come out because it's going off in the opposite direction of what I really want. So I do want to see if I could try to get a central leader structure in place. And yet it's something that I'm going to have to slowly kind of prune back on. And you may encounter that as well with your trees, is that there's one limb that needs to come out, and yet it takes up so much of your tree that we really wouldn't advise you to take it out entirely that whole year. You may need to work it back. So with the second year of pruning then, you've got all these main cuts, yet again, back to our equation. So the water sprouts are coming out, the dead wood, 1 to 2 limb removal. You see on this semi-dwarfed fruit tree that it was pruned the previous year, and because of this pruning, it has exhibited all of this water sprout growth. That's what you're going to have to expect. There's no secret to keep this from happening. That is going to be the reaction of the tree. But as you start to kind of look at this photo especially, you can start to maybe see where the central leader branch would be on this apple tree. And you can kind of start to see where your blue scaffolds might be as well here too. So a couple of participants sent me some photos of their trees, and I want to include them today. And just can give you an idea of what your trees might look like, as well as what I'll be sharing with you all if you decide to reach out with this. So this came from Steve, and this is one of Steve's pear trees. And so you can see on the left here, this good looking tree, and you can see he's got some really good scaffolds at the base of this tree too in place. And from there, it is just, you see opportunities. What I tried to do with his, especially the red up there, is that there's a lot of water sprouts from there. And so there's an opportunity there to maybe think about the direction of the tree, or even potentially kind of removal of them too. That could be kind of a clear cut that Steve could potentially do. The same here too, you kind of see a central leader here in the green. And the reason I kind of declared it the central leader is just based on how straight it is. So it's a good place to be as far as just keeping that in shape. One thing to mention is that the central leader should always be your tallest branch. It should always be that main central branch, and should be the tallest one. And so with that case, what Steve could potentially do is he could prune out that scaffold branch that's a little bit higher up, that's kind of a little bit in the way of the tree, a little bit taller than what your central leader is to be. Other places to note is you can kind of see that there's opportunities on the right side where some of the branches are growing into the tree, so those could certainly be pruned out. He may also find that there is some scaffold replacements on that right side in between those scaffold branches to potentially have another scaffold develop. One of the other things you'll note, that base scaffold level, the bottom scaffold level, you see they're just starting to grow upwards. And that would be where you would want to come back on both sides and try to prune them just so they continue to lay as horizontal as possible. Because right now they're just starting to grow up a little bit with it. But certainly you can see with this photo of Steve's tree is that the central leader is very clearly there, and the scaffolds are there, and it's just trying to kind of clean them up a little bit more. And because of the size of this tree, certainly 30 to 40% of that tree could be quite a bit of limbs, really. Steve also said in this Honeycrisp tree, so this is one that certainly looks like a dwarf tree to me. And what we can kind of see is that when we think, yet again, 30 to 40% coming off in a season is really not a lot. The scaffolds look to be in pretty good places. There's a couple of places you see on the right where we have almost competing scaffolds, if you will. You also have the ability to kind of bend these branches down to get more of that horizontal shape that we're really after with scaffolds here too, which could be an opportunity. Further up in the central leader, where you kind of see it goes much further up, you do kind of see that you've got these two scaffolds that are on either side of the tallest part of the central leader. And so those could probably be pruned out just because they're a little bit higher up than what you really want. But you could see them kind of three defined kind of layers of scaffolds within here, going in different directions. But yet again, I mean, 30 to 40% on a tree like this is really not going to be a lot. And sometimes you may find that you just want to wait a couple of years, maybe 1 or 2 seasons, to get a little bit more growth for it. And you might be able to do this with the Honeycrisp, perhaps, where you get a bit more growth with it. But you could also do a little bit of pruning at this stage with it too. One of the things you'll note in this photo is also that he has a tree guard in place. And that's something that we do recommend for deer populations, is to have some kind of deer barrier if you've encountered deer for quite some time. There was a number of photos that one of our participants, Ben, provided from Freeport High School. And so this is certainly one of the photos you see here, which looks to be a dwarf tree, one of their apple pear trees. It's a lot of red, and you'll note the red, the water sprouts, the suckers, a lot of them can really easily come out. They're not serving you much purpose. They're a little bit lower on the tree than what we really like. Especially you can see right at the base of the tree, there's a number of suckers that could come out there. And they're a little bit lower than what we're really after. So this first kind of line of scaffolds is really what you're looking at and having, and then from there developing a little bit further. You'll note too on the right side that you've got a scaffold that's going 2 directions. It's growing vertically, it's also growing downward. And you almost want to prune right to where it's very as horizontal as possible, is really what you're after. You'll also see there's a lot of secondary scaffolds in the red that are just really weighing down those limbs and really keeping them from really providing a lot of growth for this tree. So yet again, 30 to 40% is going to be not a lot on especially a dwarf or semi-dwarf tree. And you can see that most of the focus is going to be lower on that tree where the suckers are in the red. This is a tree provided by Art. So this is much older tree. This is a Tolman Sweet, which you see here. And this tree is one that you may have very similar to your backyard. And what I mean by that is that I see a lot of these trees where they're very toleration trees. My family has a lot of these trees. You may have these trees as well, where they're just much older. And when it comes to their pruning needs, certainly I'm not expecting to remove one of the central leaders. The tree is what it is. And when it comes to pruning them, it might actually be just kind of cleaning up the right and the left when it comes to kind of those water sprouts that are developing on the scaffold branches. I think you certainly could get away with potentially doing some replacement scaffolds here, but overall, I still think you have the ability to mostly kind of focus on kind of cleaning up both sides of the tree. You'll also note on the right side of that one central leader branch, I have it going 3 to 4 different directions. And this is something where you could come in and decide the direction of the central leader. That's one thing that, depending on the height and depending on how you feel about the tree, that is something we see a lot of, is that the tree is growing upward, but now it has 4 or 5 different directions it needs to go, and you need to decide on a direction for the tree. Yet again, it's based on the height, it's based on your comfort, but certainly it's one where you can do something with it. You also note that like the lowest scaffold branches are ones that you really want to encourage as much as you can. And the reason for that is that they're going to be right at eye level. They're going to be very easy for you to harvest from. And a lot of these older trees tend to want to focus so much energy higher up, and yet we want to think more closer to the ground. So that lower level or scaffolds is where I would try to encourage and really spend some making sure that they're staying as horizontal as you can. And keep in mind too, I've shown you some pears, I've shown you some apple trees. Certainly you could also do this for your peaches or your cherries if you so chose, but typically we see this central leader style mostly for apples, pears, and some others. This was provided by Christine. And so this is one where you can see the branches are pretty, the width of them seems to be in a pretty good place where you could be doing some really good modifications of it. You'll note that I kind of felt like there were maybe 4 central leader branches in here. And depending on the width of them, you might be able to remove one of them. I still think you want to be a little bit cautious of it because that certainly could be your big cut for the season. And certainly you have a lot of potentially other ones that you might consider taking out. I also kind of noted that there's some branches that are just growing straight downward, and you see that in the red. And those are branches that I still want to potentially prune out, but I also want to see maybe, if I walked around this entire tree, I might encounter that these branches are good scaffolds that I want to keep in place. I just want to shape them up. You also kind of note on the right side that there's a couple of places where the secondary scaffolds are kind of growing straight up against the horizontal branch, that horizontal scaffold that I have in place. So overall, you think about 30 to 40%, this is a tree that you could get some pretty good shape, I think. I think depending on what you're after and what your goals are, it has the potential to kind of get in a pretty good shape with it. And certainly a lot of your scaffold branches are in good places and just need to be pruned up a little bit more to provide a good shape to them. But certainly, I don't know if you would get back all the way to 1 central leader. I think you're still going to have 2 central leaders, potentially 3 central leaders. I think maybe 1 could potentially come out. So that gives you an idea. If you send me some photos, we can talk a little bit more, and I'll send all of those that sent photos, and I'll send your photos back with the color and talk to you a little bit about what I suggest you might do. Yet again, they're your trees. These are just meant as some advice that you might consider. So we're going to shift over a little bit now into stone fruit as well as to espalier, which you see here. We had a number of folks ask about this as they were thinking more critically on potentially putting out some fruit trees, but wanted to try this kind of design. And this is one where we see has potential, but it's just going to require more work on your behalf. And this is where you're growing flat against the wall or you have another structure, thinking of almost like how grapes grow where they have a trellising design, but they need a little bit more, more structure and they need a little bit more focus with them. This is one that can take quite some time, sometimes 5 to 6 years for establishment. And you may have better success with those newer, very young trees and also very much semi-dwarf trees. I think you could get away with a dwarf tree that maybe is reaching 8 to 10 feet tall, but I think you're going to have better success with a semi-dwarf tree of 14 to 16 feet tall, if not taller. Apples tend to work best for them because they tend to have wood that is a little more bendy and allows you to kind of hook them in place. You might be able to get away with pears, peach, cherries, and others. And the other word of caution here is that you may be doing a little bit of light pruning throughout the growing season for this with it. But you note in this design from the University of Florida, that, you're kind of structuring your scaffold branches vertically, I'm sorry, not vertically, horizontally against a wire. And from there, that's how they're kind of growing. And another thing to mention here too, yet again, with apples, if you're going to go that route, you need more than one variety. So it's not going to be that you just get away with one apple on an SBA design. I played around a little bit with this to kind of show you, if you were thinking about doing this spring, you would certainly buy a whipped tree, and then you're going to do a heading cut. So right where that black line is, you would do a heading cut in year one. And the idea is that you're going to have all those water sprouts develop into scaffold branches. And from there, you're going to wire them against a wire, kind of a post system. And you'll note the gray circles is where you would be tying these up. And yet again, the scaffold branches are going to produce your fruit. And so that's really what you're after here is that. The other thing you're going to have to do is just kind of prune a little bit more here and there with it. But certainly, as you can imagine, it's going to take a couple of years to kind of get into some shape as you go along with this design. I think it can work, and if others have had good success, please feel free to share in the chat box, and we can talk about it at the end today. You see, kind of, I placed a little red where the water sprouts would develop that would probably need to be pruned out, and certainly, it's a very hands-on kind of system. But small spaces could work really well depending on what type of fruit tree you're growing. For our last group, this is cherry, this is peach, this is that stone fruit group, which we do see off and on in our growing area. I know a number of participants sent photos of fruit trees of stone fruit. I myself have peach trees that I planted this spring, as well as some peach trees at our Rockford office. These tend to have a single trunk about 18 to 30 inches high, and then we have about 2 to 5 scaffold branches close together vertically. You can kind of see that kind of this open bowl center shape where the branches are kind of growing with more of a curvature, if you will. We also tend to not say, no branches facing southwest. This tends to be just based on sunlight issues that we don't recommend that. So that's where that terminology of a compass shape comes into place as you think about your branches. And then you want to make sure kind of a crotch angles of 40 to 90 degrees is really what you're after. I guess this main structure. Now, as I share with you, this can work for very newly planted cherry, peach, and other stone fruit, but you may encounter that your trees are central leader or just will never get there, and that's totally okay. So for the open center pruning, which you see here in this diagram, the first year spring, you're trying to kind of create that open center shape. And then as it goes along into that second year, the red marks are to denote the pruning that you would be doing. You can also imagine though, you're still thinking of 30 to 40% here. And at this stage, by the third year, it should be a pretty good shape that could allow for this. The only word of caution here is, especially on dwarf and semi-dwarf trees, I want you to have peaches for the season. And so you may find that you need to be a little cautious with how much you're pruning and how much shape you're getting after. The peach tree photo, which you see here on the right, is the actual peach bud. So if you have peaches, cherries, and others, you will find the peach buds will look like this in the black circle. So it looks like you have 2 little leaves on either side and the fruit is in the middle. Right above it is the leaf bud. So you can see directly at the top is the leaf bud that does not have a fruit bud. So as you're thinking of getting your fruit trees stone fruit in shape, you certainly want to think about where you're making the cuts. And you may find that you're not as aggressive with pruning, because I certainly know in our area, we only tend to get stone fruit every couple of years due to weather. So this is one of my peach trees that I planted. This is Reliance, I believe. You can see that it was planted this spring, had a lot of growth when it arrived, and I've got my scaffolds in place and a bit of a central leader as well. But yet again, I'm still thinking, okay, I can only take out 30 to 40%. And what that means is that, year one, that branch is going to come out. And then year 2 on the right, is where my other branch is going to come out, just because collectively, those are two big parts of my tree. Ideally, by removing both of those, it should start to get me into a bit of that open bowl, fruit bowl shape that we're really after. That's kind of my goal. And then from there, you know, as I think about what might be pruned this winter, some of the red will certainly come out where we have these water sprouts that are developing. It's liable to, I might develop one or two of them into a bit more of a more of my scaffold to kind of get that shape, if I'm thinking of. This is the one that was pruned by the deer, so certainly not doing a lot of pruning this season. Oddly, it feels like the deer pruned what needed to be pruned out. You can see that I have 3 good scaffolds in place. We're going to see how they develop this upcoming season. Right now I have 1 scaffold below that on the left side, a very smaller one that maybe is going to be part of that kind of open bowl center shape. But as of right now, I don't think I'm going to be pruning this contender peach, which you see here. It was dwarf, it was much smaller than the previous one. So I may not be pruning much with it. One of our final ones to show here, this is a cherry tree in our Rockford office. I'm sorry, this is a peach tree from our Rockford office. This was planted about 8 years ago. We've had good years with peaches, some years not as much. You can certainly see that this is one that has 4 central leader branches. I have tried to prune out some of them, some of the bigger scaffold branches, but because it was planted before my time, because it has also not been pruned as much, I'm at a state here too where I may not be able to remove one of the central leaders with it. I'm still debating it. We still need to look at it this season because it just has so many scaffolds and unwanted that need to be pruned out. You know on the left that there's a scaffold in the blue way too close to the ground. It's about a foot from the ground. So certainly that was one that was pruned out a couple of years last season. But we have a lot of other branches that really need more attention than what the central leader one is at this point. And this is what you may encounter, and that's totally fine. You know, expect that you may have the stone fruit that's just not going to get to that open bowl center shape. And you just have to accept that that's what that tree shape is going to look like. So we're getting to wrap up. I know some of you posted some questions in the chat box, so I want to get through those as well. Occasionally I get questions about what apple or fruit variety this is. I'm really poor about identifying different varieties, but there's a couple of resources I've used before that work okay. Sometimes orangepippin.com is one I've used. There's the Midwest Fruit Explorers group that a number of people are involved in and really like. It's a very hands-on group organization that focuses a lot on backyard production. Today's presentation, there's an older presentation of this that's on our University of Illinois Local Foods channel, which you can find on YouTube, entitled Pruning Old Apple Trees. I will send you a link I hope in the next couple of days with today's recording, but you can also find it on our YouTube channel, and we have a short URL of that, and that's the wrong URL. I'll send that out later today, but it has the backyard orchard, and that presentation goes into a lot of the stuff we didn't get to talk about, like selection, varieties, insect, disease management, a lot of things like that. There's also a number of good resources on pruning out there from Oregon State I really like, as well as Michigan State, and the SBA pruning from University of Florida is also a really good resource. If you're looking to manage insects and diseases, the Great Lakes IPM is one that a lot of growers will use to order traps, sprays, kind of other things to manage those insects and diseases that we sometimes encounter. So as we get wrapped up today, just want to mention, you know, really think about your shape. And I think what I've found is that as I have colored my trees on their photos, it's begun to give me a great understanding of what needs to be pruned and what needs to stay. And I have also found it's given me much more confidence that when it comes to pruning and not as much hesitation sometimes, because I have a shape, I have an idea of what this could look like. Try to find your leaders, try to consider what the leaders could look like, the direction the leaders should go to. Look for your scaffold branches. That can really be helpful because you can identify that fruit and figure out where the fruit is going to be for that upcoming season. Every tree tends to have a big cut. Find the big cut for 2021. That should be a great New Year's resolution. Find the big cut on your fruit trees. And I also want to say, expect a long-term practice here. Really take to heart that this is something that you have the ability to do to prune your trees, to get them the shape that really works for you. One of the things to also mention is that, make your cuts, but don't worry too much if you did the wrong cut. As a previous extension specialist said, at the end of the day, it's still a fruit tree, even if it looks like a rough fruit tree. And I can tell you from my own experience, from my family's experience, and from others I talk with, we all make the wrong cut sometimes. This is the gamble we do when it comes to fruit trees. So that's my email address. So a lot of y'all email me. You can also directly reach me at that phone number. You can also find our YouTube page at go.illinois.edu/JSW extension YouTube. You, of course, will get a link to today's recording that will be housed on our YouTube channel. But yeah, feel free to send me some photos if you want. Just want to mention I am going to be out of the office starting on Friday for the next 2 weeks. So I may not be able to get around to kind of any new photos that come my way with this. So well, let's see what questions we can answer. And I'm going to turn my video back on if it works for me. All right, so Leanne asked, you mentioned that more than one kind of apple is needed. What about pears? Occasionally in the pear guide, they will recommend more than one variety. And they will say that, this variety of pears works well for this other one variety. We still find that pears will develop fruit much more than, say, an apple. The apple is just not going to develop that fruit. So I would still say if you were thinking of new fruit trees for the orchard, consider varieties, adding different varieties for your pears with it. I think that would be a great thing, especially with yields. If you currently have pears and you find that they've been yielded well for you, you may find that you don't need another one with it. Monica asks, you may have already said this, but what is the ideal spacing of scaffolds on a dwarf or semi-dwarf tree? So with that spacing, I would probably go for about 1.5 feet if you could with the dwarf and the semi-dwarf trees. I know it's going to be very hard, especially on a dwarf tree, to have, say, 1.5 feet spacing on a tree that we know is going to be about 8 to 10 feet in height. When we think about a standard tree, you're probably at about 2.5 to 3 feet spacing, but I would think probably dwarf, semi-dwarf, look for about 1.5 feet, and I think you'd be okay with it. A follow-up question, what would be the reason for replacing scaffolds? Better crotch angles or more ideal spacing? So it certainly could be both. You could find that if you have these really great, scaffolds in place, you may find that they're just growing kind of too close to that main stem of your branch. And that could be something that you really want to think about, is replacing them with it. So it could be that this angle is too much, it's too close to the tree. And the thing that I find, especially with standard trees, is that the scaffold branches can get too big. And this is where the splits are going to occur on your trees, as if this is getting it. One thing that this question brings up is that your scaffold branch should always be a smaller width than your main central leader branch. And that may be something that you're encountering, is that this branch is getting too big of a width to really support that central leader. And that's where it needs to come out with it. Art asks, how would you define as dormant and safe to prune? So there was a photo, I'm going to go back really quickly, Art, because you will see there's a photo I have in here from North Carolina. Forgive me, I'm going to go back. And there is, we're going really back. All right, so you asked about dormancy, Art. You're going to see the spurs in this photo here is dormancy. So if you go out to your fruit trees today and you see that these are in that dormancy phase, you could continue to prune. And that could be the same with, if you're looking at the calendar it's March 10th, March 11th, and you're still in dormancy, you could still potentially prune. The only thing to be cautious of is that these growth stages move very quickly. And so if it's March and my apples are still in dormancy based on what that looks like, it could still move quickly to the next growth stage. That's really not what you want to do. I have a link to those photos, so I'll send that to you because it shows every single growth stage of those apple trees. Leanne asks, if the apple trees are older and long neglected, should the pruning focus be on bringing down the height? So do almost a 20% pruning, 20% cleanup, and 20% lowering the height. That's a fantastic idea, Leanne. If you have a very old, neglected, standard tree, and you certainly can see that there's goals you're after, I would think, okay, let's try to clean out and get it in a better shape rather. Let's also think that, okay, my scaffolds are higher up. So let's look at eye level and see if I have any suckers that I could baby for a couple of years to replace as a scaffold. That would be an excellent idea for a very old and neglected tree if you're trying to get to that productivity phase. Christine asks, can you trim scaffold branches closer to the tree? You could, I think, with the scaffold branches, you still have to keep in mind that, the fruit is going to develop off of them for the apples and the pears. So as you're thinking of a scaffold branch, you still want to think about, where it is. So for instance, we think about, say, that Christmas tree shape for your apple tree, Christine, for example. You always want the lowest one to be the longest, if you will. And then the next row of scaffolds should be shorter than that and so forth, because we're trying to get as much sunlight to all those scaffolds. So, as I look at scaffold branches, I may find that I need to prune this back just slightly, but I still want to think about what that scaffold above looks like. So this one should always be longer than the one right above it and so forth, like that Christmas tree shape. You may also find that your scaffold branch is so massive that it is going to require you to kind of slowly prune back for the next couple of years. That's certainly what I have with some of my trees, is the scaffold is just way too big and I need to prune it back slowly, unfortunately. So any other questions? I got the whiteout board. Okay. All right, well, you've got my email and my phone number as well. So, if there's anything else I can do for you, please let me know. I'm with you there. I've got to prune my fruit trees. I've got to prune the Rockford fruit trees. I'm sure other fruit trees will come my way. And to those that sent today's class, really appreciate you sending those, to my direction. If you do have any more fruit trees you want to send my way, please feel free to do so. And I'll send you back kind of your own little email consultation. I apologize because I was hoping that this would allow me to mark up and move my mouse, and you could see that. So Zoom didn't let me do that. But otherwise, send trees my way. I hope everything goes well for you when it comes to pruning, and feel free to stay in